Part 2, Episode 1. 5 years ago, when our work expanded, we had to start recruiting engineers, technicians and scientists from the outer world to work on Triton. Far was one such technician, so let us begin with Far. He is the one who led us to the Bow Lady. He is the one who held the forgotten memory. He volunteered for a sleep trial where we were testing a new synth drug called dextrometaprotazine. We hoped it would speed up the integration of certain neural functions, networks that would help us get there faster. One of the unexpected outcomes or happy accidents was that it opened memories that had been dropped like a stone in water. Memories that were languishing at the bottom of a sea. Memories that were waiting for the GYRE to come along and retrieve them. Over the course of several visits to the sleep lab, we found a trace of something he'd buried so deep we only got a glimpse of what had happened. Blink, and we'd have missed it. We imagine it must be something like spotting a deer in the forest. As soon as you realise it's there, it's gone. We thought at first it was Far who'd wanted to hide this encounter deep within the parts of his mind he had very little access to. But if he knew how to hide something like this, why would he? It was so beyond his capacity for understanding that he would have instinctively erased it. But this was more than erased. Someone had tried to eradicate it, cut all connections and burn away the bridges so it couldn't be traced. It could have been the after effects of trauma. Trauma can make people do things they wouldn't normally do, see things in ways they wouldn't normally see, and remember or even forget things in peculiar ways. We took Far back to a time before he came to Triton, to a time on the mainland, in the outer world. Far is standing on the upper balcony of the shopping mall. He's just left the cinema complex where he watched one of the Marvel Universe movies. We can feel his disorientation. He is feeling dazed after being immersed in the onslaught of the action hero Spider-Man. And now he's back to reality, leaning on the rail looking down into the central mall of the out-of-town shopping complex. He watches the small children being bounced up and down on the bungee rigging. He is holding a styrofoam cup of iced coffee, and as he turns it slowly, the animated cartoon graphic of Spider-Man emblazoned on the cup swings from skyscraper to skyscraper. Such a clever trick, triggered by rotating the cup. He is entranced by how the holographic cells catch the light. He digs his thumbnail into the styrofoam cup, creating a pattern of overlapping arcs. Suddenly, he spots a figure dashing through the crowds and instinctively moves to the escalator to get a better view. Below, a woman is cutting through the shoppers in such a way that it reminds us of how we cut through the waves in our great expanse of ocean. We are intrigued and becoming enthralled. There's a terrifying snap and a collective sharp intake of breath as one of the bungee ropes springs loose from its fastening and a child is catapulted high into the mall's rooftops. Everyone on both floors of the mall turn their heads to watch. Time seems to slow and the air becomes thick like jelly. We spot the woman still running through the crowd. Far is running down the escalator after her. As we map the event being reconstructed in his memory, we can't help but be amazed by how quickly his brain becomes overwhelmed with this all-consuming and compelling urgency to give chase. Everyone is watching the child travel through the air and reach the apex of its trajectory. The child becomes doll-like, so relaxed it could be asleep. It hovers in mid-air for a moment before it starts its inevitable descent. Then the collective mind of the watching crowd realizes in an instant the horror of what is about to unfold once the child hits the ground. The woman runs and dives forwards. As she hits the ground, she turns into a giant marshmallow-like pillow. No one notices the sudden appearance of the giant inflatable pillow. They're too busy watching the child falling rapidly back down to earth. Everyone had already imagined the sickening crunch the child's body would make as it hits the highly polished floor. But just as soon as they projected this image, it is replaced with the reality of the child landing effortlessly in the middle of a giant white inflatable pillow. The crowd let out a gasp of relief. They surged forward, surrounding the child, who is scooped up and security is called. The police and paramedics arrive, statements are taken, and everyone is soon back to their normal business of milling around and shopping. Far stares at the giant pillow without blinking. We feel his thoughts drift away like seaweed on a receding tide. An image comes to his mind of him as the hunter, waiting in a hide for a deer to appear. It's primitive and instinctive. And then, in the blink of an eye, the huge pillow is gone. We want to rewind and replay this again. We can't quite believe it. We spot the woman making her way out of the square. Far springs into action to follow her. He is the hunter in pursuit of his prey. His mind and body are united and focused on this one intention. He zigzags through the crowd, dodging round people as if they're static trees. He keeps as close to her as he can, but she's always just ahead of him. He loses her and panics. He spots her again and is off before he knows it. We feel the incredible surge of adrenaline, excitement, and pure instinct. He is the only one who saw the woman run through the crowd and dive onto the floor. No one else saw her turn into a giant pillow. No one else saw her running through the crowd to save the child, even before the child was catapulted into the air. He finds her sitting on one of the stools at a sushi bar. He leans against a pillar and watches from a distance. He wants to make sure she's not going anywhere or meeting anyone. He wants to make sure she hasn't seen him following her. His heart is still racing. His thoughts are chaotic. He's finding it hard to focus. It's like the cracks in the dam wall have finally burst and water is pouring out and flooding the valley. Images from the Spider-Man movie repeat over and over. His consciousness begins to blur and fragment. When he's got his breath back, he walks over to the sushi bar and sits in the empty seat next to her. He tries to glimpse her out of the corner of his eye. She is hunched over her bowl, moving food to her mouth in a continuous motion of chopsticks. We noticed a flash of green from a ring on her finger, a jewel, an emerald perhaps. He says, "I saw what you did back there." He's trying to sound casual, but it comes out fake. She ignores him and carries on slurping her noodles. He tries to speak calmly, but his head is beginning to spin. "It was something else. I mean, truly, I've never seen anything like it." His body is beginning to sway, slowly at first, so he hardly notices it. We feel like he might faint. We mouth the words with him, silently, hoping he'll not mess this up. His words hang awkwardly in the air. "How did you do it? Make the pillow appear out of thin air?" She stops eating, but doesn't say anything. He feels an ache in his shoulder, a dull pain in his knee. As we search deeper, we begin to theorize that magic tricks can not only be enacted intentionally, but they may also happen spontaneously in times of great shock. This is something we never considered before. It may account for many things we still underestimate. Farr turns in his seat to angle himself towards her. He's planning this to be his big finale. The hunter has cornered the prey and is about to go in for the kill. We try to see her face, but it's covered by her long dark hair. We examine the ring that seems to be emitting a light from within. No emerald can do that. It must have been fabricated. This is noted as worthy of a further investigation. We have synth materials that can generate their own light, but they're not out in the world yet. The ring is pulsing. Its light is glowing brightly, then dimming. Far is mesmerized. We feel his consciousness begin to slide. He feels lost and exhausted. He has an overwhelming urge to sleep. He mumbles, "How is that even possible? It's got to be a trick, right? But a trick like that, and saving a child, this'll go viral. If I didn't see it with my own eyes, I'd never have believed it." The woman puts her chopsticks down. A line of sweat breaks across Far's brow. The intensity of the chase is catching up with him. The woman lifts her bowl into the air and holds it there for a moment, and in that moment we feel the whole of Triton move and creak. We feel the ocean rise and fall, and in that moment she holds the bowl in the air and turns it in her hand, so the light catches the logo of the sushi bar emblazoned on its side. She turns the bowl slowly, pressing her thumbnail in, marking the ceramic surface in overlapping arcs, just as Far had done with his styrofoam cup. And in that moment, as she lifts her bowl, the bowl seems to hover in mid-air, just as the child had done. Then she lowers the bowl and slowly places it back on the bar. She gestures with her hand for him to try. She moves her hair away from her face, hooks it round her ear, and she looks at him. And that's when we see her for the first time, the bowl lady. And as we see her, she sees us. Her expression drops, her eyes widen, there's a sudden flash of black, like when a flock of startled jackdaws fly up out of a field. We are knocked back by the flash and nearly lose our connection. We hold on by a thread and can only watch what happens next. Far picks up the sushi bowl, lifts it up in the air, even turns it in his hand just as she had done. Just how he'd turned his cup of iced coffee on the balcony of the mall after watching the Spider-Man movie. But now, he can't put the bowl down. The blood drains from his face. His limbs are numb and his skin feels clammy. We scramble to reconnect, but something is blocking our pathway. The ache in his limbs is not from us. The sway in his body is not from the gyre. His frozen arm holding the bowl in mid-air is not of our doing. We watch her take a paper napkin from the counter and draw on it with a pen. We wish we had that pen. She folds the napkin in half and places it in front of Far. She then moves off her stool and walks away. Far is stuck like this till she's gone. His frozen arm thaws and he puts the bowl down. He vigorously shakes his hand and arm to get the blood circulating again. He looks down at the spider she's drawn on the paper napkin, scrunches it up and throws it away. His arm is stiff and achy for an hour. We try to burrow down into the numbness, but it's too vague and uncertain. If he'd kept the spider she'd drawn, we could have found her straight away. We could have analysed how she held her pen, how she drew each line, how she shaded in the spider's body. The trace on his hand, where he'd scrunched up her drawing, was all we had to go on. This left us with an intriguing problem. Here was a person who'd gone to great lengths to remain hidden, and yet we were able to see her, and more surprisingly, somehow she could see us. We of course have a duty of care. We leave no trace when we've mined someone's memories. Far came out of his sleep and went back to his life, business as usual. He's a technician after all. They are the easiest to access. They're like everything black and white. They don't believe in things they can't see, things they can't reduce or calculate. He may have a few aches and pains, mild flu symptoms perhaps, but he'll assume that is what is generally known as Tritonitis. And we would now begin our search for the bold lady. Part 2, Episode 2. Bea looked away and shouted, "Gyre, can you put some clothes on? I've told you, I don't like you walking round like that." "You mean naked?" He jumped out in front of her, then ran into the bathroom saying, "I'm going out." "Out? What do you mean? Out where?" Then she realised what he meant. For years she'd blocked out the fact that we still went in the ocean, but now she was face to face with it again. She heard him opening and closing the bathroom cabinet doors. He shouted, "Have you seen my skin jars?" She spoke to him through the closed bathroom door. "I put all your stuff on the shelves by the sink." She heard him rooting around. "Oh yeah, thanks." The door flew open. Bea jumped back at the sight of Gyre's naked chest in her face. "I told you to put some clothes on," she said, trying to move out of his way. He unscrewed the jar and took out a scoop of gel and started rubbing it on his legs. "We're off for a swim. You want to come?" He looked at her, but she still had her face turned away. He covered his entire body in the thick green gel that his skin absorbed almost immediately. It left him with a silver and green sheen. He applied a second coat and Bea took herself off to the kitchen to make herself a coffee. She couldn't get into an argument about him going swimming. That would open up a wound that hadn't fully healed, even after all these years. Like a burn to the skin that initially stings intensely and leaves a darkening scar for years and years. And Bea is the one who remembers, even when remembering is like a dislocated shoulder. The ball and socket joint was only ever held in place by ligaments and tendons, and when torn they repair slowly. Closing down was the only way she coped, but we were slowly prizing her open. The skin gel we've developed lets us swim in the open sea without the need for wetsuits. It keeps our body temperature stable no matter what the water temperature is, even when it's close to freezing. And this means we can all swim naked, which of course we love. We added the silver-green tinge so we look more aquatic, and the pulsing phosphorescence makes our bodies glow when we swim at night and into the dawn. We modified the gel so it gives off various chemicals to repel anything that might sting or be tempted to take a bite out of us. Free diving like this attracts the curiosity of all kinds of fish and sea mammals who would have swam the other way if we still had all our noisy scuba. But now, in the empty silence, we attract not only our ocean-going friends, but also memories that float out of the human mind and into the sea in which we swim in. In the ocean, we feel what you feel. We see what you see. We hear you. As we swim shimmering in our phosphorescent glow, a flock of rays sweep past us, brushing us with their broad cloaks. A shoal of turtles on their 1,000-kilometre trek, and whales, plenty of them. We join them in their strange dance, pogoing vertically up and down until finally we begin in our swim to understand what it is they're desperately trying to say. What they're desperately trying to communicate. Get out of the way. Get out of the way. The silver and green merman put his head round the kitchen door and said, "Have you seen my fins?" "They're in the cupboard in the hallway," Bea said, then added, "Where you left them?" "Thanks, Ma." He flashed her a smile, hoping to make her laugh. Then he disappeared. "We keep a watch on them, you know," female Sam said in her warmest voice. Bea sipped her coffee. I know. With Gyre gone, Bea drifted from room to room, tidying up the trail of devastation he left in his wake. He'd arrived at the beginning of the week announcing he was staying with her for their final prep before they left for the Global Ocean Floor Conference. Their time of recompression, he called it. He said, the medical team won't give you your final jabs if you don't sort out your sleep pattern. He was taking an air of authority he'd never used with her before. I'm here to make sure you eat properly, cut down on the drinking and stop smoking, at least for a week. In this state, your body's producing 50% less antibodies, so the final course of injections they want to give you won't really work unless you sleep properly and we get you healthy. He insisted on sleeping in her bed, which she refused point blank. How am I supposed to get my proper sleep with your great sweaty body next to me? He set up a mattress next to her bed. We have to be in close physical proximity for as long as possible to form the necessary bond. Necessary for what? It takes a while, he said. She let him have his mattress. She was getting used to giving in. It was actually easier than she imagined. Sam relieved her of her duties and responsibilities and she stopped going to the office. She had 8 hours uninterrupted sleep and woke each morning to the gentle sound of Gyre quietly singing to himself. In her dream, Bea was walking along the corridors of Triton just like normal. She could have been anywhere on any floor. She had no idea how long she'd been walking. Without realizing it, she picked up her pace and was now running. Was she chasing something or being chased? Was she the hunter or the prey? She banged her shoulder into the wall on one of the sharp corner turns. She felt the dull ache in her muscle and liked it. She banged into the wall again on the next turn. Then she started hitting herself off the walls on purpose. She ricocheted down the corridors like she was in a pinball machine. There was a wall right in front of her. She ran at it with everything she had and ran at it again. She felt the whole structure of Triton shudder. The floor in front of her fell away, leaving an open chasm that she didn't dare look down into, an open chasm that seemed to be drawing her in. She couldn't pull away. She looked down into the opening and saw the metal structural supports collapsing. The whole of Triton was collapsing in on itself. Bea woke with a jolt and realised she'd fallen asleep on the sofa. She'd been lying on her arm and it had gone numb. Her shoulder ached, and she dribbled down the side of her mouth. She swung herself up to sitting. Gyre was cooking fish for breakfast. Even though he'd showered, he still had a green and silver tinge to his skin. When we swim every day, that tinge becomes almost permanent. It shimmers in certain lights and makes our eyes seem even more bright and beguiling. Without looking up from his frying pan, Gyre jumped straight off the deep end. You're the only one who still remembers Kid Gyre, you know. We all appreciate that. We know you feel it like we do. He saw her dried tears and he saw something he hadn't seen before. She'd started to let go and didn't know how to stop unravelling. He rattled the frying pan and flipped the fish. You know he's not dead, don't you? He said casually. Bea hated it when he did this, throwing out a baited line that never failed to hook her in. She couldn't stop herself. What the hell are you talking about? He carried on cooking and started reeling her in. Kid Gyre, he is dead. Of course, in one sense, he drowned and that was tragic. But he's not really dead. You keep him in your thoughts, in your heart, in your dreams, just as we do. So he doesn't die till we all die. As Gyre spoke, Bea drifted off. It sounded like he was setting sail on the half-baked, nostalgic, romanticised journey he often journeyed on, but he switched tack and took her to a new location. We all breathed his molecules. They entered our bloodstream and ran round every organ of our bodies. We shared fluids, you might say. He shot her a cheeky glance to see if she was playing. Then he brought 2 plates of mackerel over to the table, served up with a squeeze of lime and his special mango dressing. He peeled the flesh from his fish, and with a juicy mouthful he said, I'm not the same me as I was back then. Every bone has regrown, every skin cell has died and been replaced. But the memory of Kid Gyre is still alive, and in a very real and physical sense, he is alive. In the sense of him being built into the architecture of my brain, its billions of interconnected superhighways. And beyond the brain, he tapped his head, then opened his hand, letting his fingers open to the ceiling. Beyond the biology, he's alive in the Gyre. He finished what he was saying, sure that it had hit its mark. He devoured a chunk of fish triumphantly and said, "This fish is good, isn't it?" Bea took a bite. The fish was good. It melted in her mouth. She noticed Gyre's wristband was glowing, slowly pulsing with light. She looked at him to see if he was showing any sign that might explain the wristband, but he was absorbed in stabbing and shoveling fish into his mouth. He put his fork down and held 2 fingers to each temple, then closed his eyes and said, "What am I thinking?" He opened one eye to look at her. "Did you get it?" Bea shrugged. "You were thinking about swimming." Gyre slapped his leg with excitement. "You see? You can read my mind. It's that easy. Let's try it again. Concentrate. Now what am I thinking?" Bea closed her eyes and immediately felt a space open up that seemed to unpack itself like a box. And when she looked in the box, there was a tiny horse, a perfect miniature palomino, alive and flicking its tail. She opened her eyes and looked at Gyre's grinning face. He picked up his fork and carried on eating. Bea looked at his pulsing friendship bracelet. She felt an ache in her neck, in her shoulder. She suddenly felt tired, like she could fall asleep in her breakfast plate. Gyre made over-exaggerated eating noises as he loaded up his fork. Bea took a bite of her fish, rolled it round in her mouth, then swallowed it down. She coughed violently. Gyre jumped up from his seat and started slapping her back. She couldn't swallow. She couldn't breathe. She coughed and gulped for air. She went red. She hacked at the back of her throat till whatever was there was dislodged and came into her mouth before she spat it out on the table. Gyre picked out a tiny feather in amongst the piece of fish she'd coughed up. He wiped it clean and held it up. The black and white markings formed a widening spiral. "Now would you look at that?" he said. Bea stared at the feather. What kind of strange feather was this? As far as she knew, no birds had feathers with spiral markings. And how did it get in the fish? She could still feel its taste in her mouth. She could still feel where it got stuck in her throat, where it had been stuck for a long time. The feeling and smell of it being stuck in her throat echoed and repeated in her mind. It felt like all her fears, anxieties, worries, burdens, terrors, furies, anger, rages, annoyances, irritations, regrets and grudges. She raced through all the possible meanings a feather might have, but none of them related to a feather stuck in the throat. She decided she'd ask Sam later, but for now she resigned herself to the idea that it was just another of Gyre's pranks. Gyre appeared in the doorway dressed in a shimmering green suit. Bea had been ruminating, going over how annoying it was having someone in her living space, how annoying it was having Gyre in her space, how he never tidied up or cleaned up. But now, looking at GYRE Each, this internal monologue seemed removed somehow, like she was listening to it on the radio in another room. The sight of him shimmering before her shooed all those niggles away. His green suit was made from the synth fabrics we create in the labs. The fabric can hug your body tight and be supportive, or it can be loose, flowing and smooth. Gyre's suit was in its relaxed flowing mode. Its translucent glow went well with the silvery green tinge of his skin. "We're going out," he announced, a little too dramatically. "You might want to dress up a little." Before Bea could ask where they were going, her mind was reeling. She was imagining out meant in the ocean, swimming. This tipped her into a full-blown panic. GYRE Each corrected himself. "I should have said we're going in rather than out, but going in sounds a bit odd. I'm taking you to the Gyre Palace." They've organised our leaving celebrations so it makes sense for us both to be there. This is when we first noticed he was referring to us as them. Part 2, Episode 3. The carved wooden entrance was in the style of the Polynesian sea gods and shaped like the jawbone of a giant fish. Bea had to enter the GYRE palace through the mouth. She had to bow to get under the deliberately low dip in the centre point. Then she was led down a dark, deep red corridor that twisted and turned to purposefully disorientate our guest. Then the narrow passage opened up into a huge cavernous space filled with green and purple light. Bea looked up with her eyes wide and her mouth open. This is what we are most proud of, the impact it had on her. The infinity ceiling was filled with a swirling gyre of galaxies and shooting stars. As she looked up, she felt pulled towards it, like she could just lift off the ground and be swept up into the stars. GYRE smiled. You like it then? Bea tore her gaze away and looked at GYRE Each. His eyes turned a sparkling green. The colour itself seemed to leave his eyes and move towards her, surrounding her with lights. She couldn't speak. It's good to know it works, he said. We hoped the entrance would produce the shiver. I don't know what to say. GYRE wrapped his arm round her and pulled her in close. That's okay, he laughed. It's meant to do that, leave you speechless. That's the point. He leant forward and kissed her forehead. She instinctively pulled away and immediately felt like she shouldn't have. She looked round and realised she'd been surrounded by the GYRE. We were all looking at her. We felt her heart race with embarrassment. Her hands tingled and her face flooded beetroot red. She was staring at our painted faces, looking too long into our gaze. We felt her sway as she inhaled our scent. We said, "We are honoured to have you here, Mother." Bea looked from face to face but couldn't tell who'd spoken, whose lips had moved. We noticed the sweat begin to run down her forehead. She didn't dare look down. She just kept looking at our faces, holding our gaze. She's holding our gaze too long, we said to each other. She's becoming enthralled. She'll be beguiled. She was too embarrassed to take her gaze anywhere but our faces. She didn't want to stare at our naked, painted bodies. She heard us say, "We're so thrilled and excited to have you here, Mother." GYRE Each stepped in and gently held her elbow to reassure her and said in his most charming voice, "This is the GYRE, Mother. They're preparing a celebration for you." Then he turned to us and used his words to explain, it might be a bit overwhelming for our guest to have the whole of the GYRE staring at her. We immediately stepped back. We felt Bea relaxed a little. She was thankful to have GYRE Each to hang on to. He said, "And perhaps we could wear our clothes for the time being at least." We acknowledged how he said we when he meant you, us, the GYRE, as opposed to him. Like a shoal of fish, we turned as one and dispersed. As Bea watched us glide away, she dared herself to look at our bodies. She noticed how we individually decorated ourselves in the most intricate patterns. She was suddenly gripped by a terrible pang of guilt. We felt it squeeze her intestines. She wished she'd noticed earlier. She should have said something. She turned to GYRE Each and whispered, "Have I offended them?" This was so cute it made us cry. We cry a lot. We can cry at most things, but this was a heartfelt smile of a cry. "No, not in the slightest," GYRE Each said reassuringly. "It's perfectly fine." GYRE steered Bea towards an open area finished with huge cushions and couches. "This is our lounge," he said as he dived onto a couch and laid himself out at full stretch. "This is where we lounge." He began laughing hysterically. "Do you get it? We lounge in the lounge." "Don't you get it?" Gyre said, swinging himself up to sitting. "We call it a lounge because we lounge in it." "Yes," Bea said, "I get it." He threw himself back on the sofa and shouted, "I'm lounging!" We wrapped our bodies in various cloths that we positioned with care to still show off our body art but made sure we didn't offend or surprise our guest. Then we drifted back in smaller groups so as to not overwhelm her with our collective presence. One group offered Bea plates of beautifully displayed fresh fruit, dates and nuts. A bell was rung and another group hurried in with bowls and mats to perform an elaborate tea ceremony. Then we started clapping. We began clapping when we were only a few months old. We were Gyre babies then, and it was such a natural thing to do. All the mothers and fathers joined in, and it became a game. We quickly picked up more and more complex rhythmic patterns, and when more Gyre babies came along, we taught each other our favourite clapping songs until the adults could no longer keep up. It soon became clear to us that the clapping game had mutated into a new way of communicating. Unbeknownst to the grown-ups, we created the first of our many new languages. When we started clapping for Bea, we felt her heart glow like the rising sun, till it shone so brightly she had to close her eyes and weep. She wanted to sing, to shout, to laugh and cry as the clapping swelled and swirled around her, carrying her up into the heavens, carrying away all her cares and woes. She coughed and choked like she was drowning in the clapping. She remembered the taste of the strange feather in her mouth, the tiny feather she'd coughed up at the dinner table. She saw the feather rise up in the air as our clapping reached its crescendo. Then the feather dropped and spiraled down, leaving Bea to free fall through the blue sky, hundreds of feet off the ground. We picked her up and gently brought her back down. We steadied her till she regained her balance. "Thank you," she said, as she got her breath back and wiped the tears from her eyes. We all smiled with her and laughed. We laugh a lot. We have 100 different types of laughter. This was a reassuring, comforting and supportive type of laughter. Our hands reached out to touch her and pat her, stroke her skin. We felt her warm flesh tingle. Her flesh felt full and bursting. We reached beneath her skin, but then we were too close. We'd gone too far. We felt her body stiffen, and we moved back like the receding tide. "It's okay," she said, waving her hand for us to come closer. "It's just, I'm not used to having you all so close en masse. I'm sorry, but come closer, please." We piled ourselves on top of each other in whatever way we could, till we'd completely surrounded her, until she was just part of our whole mass of bodies. She felt our weight, our sweat and bones, our hair and fat and flesh. She felt our breath and looked at our eyes, watching her. She inhaled our scent like perfume and tasted our sweat in her mouth. We decided to speak to her again with words. She gave up trying to work out which one of us was speaking. We spoke over each other. We spoke in chorus, sometimes overlapping and finishing each other's sentences. We became an angelic choir, and this was our song. "We, the Gyre, are honoured to have you here, Mother. We honour you. We have you here with us, Mother, with us in this time, which is all time and no time. And in this place, which is our place, and now it is your place." We began to sing, and our singing washed in and out like waves on a pebble beach. Then Bea began to hear our whispers cutting through our hypnotic song. The whispers were saying, "Welcome home, Mother." These voices were speaking so close to her ear, they reached inside her and she cried tears we call sorrow joy. Our hands wiped these precious tears from her face. She searched for words to speak, but there were none. She melted into our song and into our arms. She sank into the swaying mass of the gyre, and we seeped into her blood and bone. Now that she was with us, part of us, we carried on singing, but without words. O Mother, may you share with us your sorrows and laughter. Share your spirit, join with the spirit of the gyre, and rejoice with us in our extended future, exalted. When she became tired, we took her in a slow walking parade to where we all slept. She woke with 5 or 6 bodies strewn over her on the bed, and more bodies piled up on the floor. Hours and days and nights came and went like the tide. Time collapsed and rolled itself up in a blanket. She became more comfortable wearing less clothes. We decorated her body with paints and jewels. We manufacture the paint so it makes the skin feel warm and soft, and it runs over the body like warm honey. There are no mirrors or clocks in the gyre palace, so the outside world recedes till it disappears completely. She gave up trying to work out which one of us was speaking. She realized the gyre is a colony. She realized we didn't always speak to her by opening our mouths and letting shapes like boxes tumble out. She wanted to know more about the gyre, so we showed her how we decorate our bodies in markings that identify which pod we belong to. Pods have sex with other pods, but not within their own pod. She didn't say it, but we knew she listened to our moaning, shrieking and groaning, the rhythmic thump, thump, thump of our bodies penetrating each other. But we tried to be discreet and kept our sex play out of sight. When we touched her, when we lay with her, when we held and stroked her, we did so in a way that was not sexually arousing. We did it in a way that was nurturing and healing. At least we hoped it would be felt that way, and she gave no indication that our touch was nothing more or less than what it was. We had no idea where GYRE Each had gone, but he'd been gone for a few days, and then all of a sudden he appeared in the doorway with a smile so broad it couldn't help but turn into laughter, a laughter of kindness mixed with lyrical surprise. The noise of GYRE Each laughing woke Bea up. "What's so funny?" she said blearily. GYRE Each looked round the pile of limbs entwined around Bea's naked painted body and said, "I see you've settled in then." Bea looked around and realized how it must look to him. She laughed and said, "It would seem so." She showered to remove the paint and stuck on gems and jewels and found some clothes to wear. The clothes felt stiff compared to the materials we'd wrapped her in. These clothes felt confining compared to being naked and covered in fabric that adapted to her skin. The fabric and fibres of these clothes made her feel separate and disembodied. She now felt more self-conscious with clothes on than she did with them off. When she dressed, GYRE Each brought her into the great hall, where the whole of the gyre were waiting. A gong sounded, then a lone, continuous drone filled the hall. Candles were lit and incense was burning. We sat Bea in a throne-like chair and covered her in heavy gold cloth. The incense burners were placed round the throne so the smoke wafted and billowed around her as we sang a lament to the sea. Our singing gave way to a clapping pattern she'd not heard before. It sent waves rippling through her stomach. She felt the familiar heat rise up in her chest and she began to choke. There was perhaps too much smoke. She gasped for air and we realized she was weeping. The tide broke through the harbour wall and carried her away. She cried out and shouted. She sang and we sang. She wailed and let her salty tears pour down her face. We began to weep with her, and one by one we fell to the floor as if we'd been shot down, as if we'd been harpooned. We lay on the ground with our arms reaching out, trying to touch her, but we were receding, being dragged back by an invisible tide. We'd swim forwards again, arms outstretched, crying, weeping and wailing, only to be pulled back into the darkness at the edges of the hall. We carried on singing between our weeping, and slowly each surge took us further and further away till the tide of our bodies disappeared and didn't come back. Our sobs were swallowed and our singing was gone. The great hall returned to silence, with only Bea sat on her throne, draped and weighed down in gold cloth. GYRE Each appeared at her side and slowly took off and folded each cloth until finally their weight was lifted. And she took GYRE's hand and he guided her out of the hall, out of the GYRE palace and back into the world of Triton. Part 2, Episode 4. Due to the heightened security situation, it was too risky to chopper them to the mainland. Bea sat in the padded leather seating of the submersible shuttle. It was more spacious and more luxurious than she'd imagined. She took off her shoes and wriggled her toes in the thick, carpeted floor. She kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see something, anything, go past in the darkness, but nothing did. Once they got below 200 meters, there was no sunlight. The walls of the shuttle creaked under the pressure. GYRE assured her it was nothing to worry about. The submersible could safely go down to 4,000 meters, but she wasn't convinced. She turned her focus to the bank of screens displaying the computer-generated mapping of the terrain they were travelling over. The flat seabed was beginning to rise on a slow incline. She expected to feel some claustrophobia or some anxiety or excitement, but all she was feeling was boredom. Her clothes bothered her. They felt stiff, like they were trying to contort her body into a shape it didn't want to be in. GYRE looked up from the book he was reading. "That's the menopause," he said, then turned his attention back to his book. Bea tried not to, but she couldn't help herself. She took the bait and snapped back at him, the flushing heat fueling her fury. "What do you know about the menopause?" Without looking up from his book, he said, "We studied it in evolutionary biology." He gave a little flick of his head to move a strand of hair out of his eyes. She hated it when he did that. He carried on. "There's a few other sea mammals, orcas in particular it occurs in, but the menopause must have given the early humanoids an edge. Otherwise, what's the point of sticking around once you've given birth to and raised the next gen?" Bea felt her ears heat up like they'd been put in a toaster. She got up, walked around and fanned herself with a piece of card. "So what is the point?" she said. "What's the evolutionary advantage of me sticking around? Is that what you're saying? What's the point of me?" GYRE looked at her and then resumed reading. She couldn't bear the silence. She couldn't bear him. He was doing it on purpose. Bea watched the bank of screens that showed them moving across a growing number of hills and valleys. The submersible then changed course and began skirting round a seamount that towered above them 1.5 kilometers high. She looked over at GYRE and said, "Where are we going?" GYRE looked at the screen. "There's something over this ridge I want to show you." GYRE turned on the sub's lights so more of the terrain could be seen. As they went over the ridge, the lights of the sub picked out an oval shape that looked like a lake. Bea could see the lake's surface shimmering in the sub's floodlights, giving it an eerie, milky glow. Wisps of mist began to swirl and rise on the surface. GYRE turned the sub so it began a slow circle round the lake. The submersible slowed as it got close to the middle of the lake. It hovered for a moment, then gently landed. the submersible began to float on the lake. An eel-like fish swam in front of them and recoiled quickly as it touched the surface. "What is this?" Bea whispered. "Technically," Gyre said, "it's a brine pool. The ocean currents are quite weak in this secluded trough, so the pool doesn't mix with the ocean above it. There's a layer of salt under the seabed, and the salt is more buoyant than the mud, so it seeps out and forms this pool." She looked at the strange view and wondered if they'd landed on another planet. She stared at the lake and saw a boat emerging out of the mist, the golden boat from her dream. She looked closer and saw a figure standing in the boat. A woman was beckoning. The voice Bea heard seemed to come from the lake itself. It was then that GYRE Each said, "Mother, what can you tell us about our grandmother, Jay's mother?" Bea wasn't taken aback by this sudden shift in conversation. She tilted her head and swayed a little. When her voice came, it sounded as soft as silk. "What do you want to know?" she said. "The Gyre need to know everything there is to know." It was Bea speaking, but it didn't sound like Bea. She'd never met Jay's mother, she only knew what Jay had told her. Her thoughts rolled in, one on top of the other. Her thoughts were becoming tangled in the wisps of milky mist that spun and spiraled from the depths of the deepest part of the lake. It was the voice of the lake that spoke to us. Jay's mother was known as Jules, and Jules sang. She sang sweet lullabies to Jay when he was a baby. She rocked him gently in her arms in the warmth of a fire close by. She wore her hair scrunched up on top of her head. He played with the loose strands that would tumble down on all sides like tentacles. She jangled with all the bangles and rings and bracelets she wore. She stuck it out on the camps in those early days when so many others gave up. She coped with the cold and the mud and the endless days of rain. Everyone sang round the campfire to keep their spirits up, but when Jules sang, everything would stop. Time would slow down. The air itself would become thick like jelly. When we heard this, our hearts leapt and then wept. We know this jelly. We feel it too. When you put your hands in a bowl of jelly before it sets, you feel the liquid begin to solidify around your hands. You feel it squeeze around your skin and bones and muscle. That's what it feels like to be part of the Gyre. All those aches and pains in your muscles and joints, the fever, the turmoil, the tuning of the musical instrument in preparation for the concert to begin. One winter the wind just blew and wouldn't stop. They were holed up in their van being battered by the howling gale all night and all through the next day. It was relentless. They couldn't open the van doors, the wind was so strong. The next night Jules told Jay to sit tight. "I'm going out to see what it's like." Child Jay said, "Don't, Mummy." "It's okay. I'll be straight back." Jules forced open the van door just enough to squeeze out. Then the door slammed shut behind her, and she was gone. The van rocked so violently, Jay feared it might blow right over. Then the van door blew open and a gust of wind blew in that sent everything flying. Jules appeared, holding onto the door frame. She shouted, "Jay, help me shut this door!" They both leant with all their weight against the door to keep it closed. It felt like they were keeping out a wild bear hell-bent on breaking into their van. Jules looked at Jay, took a deep breath and blew against the door like she was blowing out candles on a birthday cake. She took another deep breath and nodded for Jay to join in. They both blew against the door. Jules took a huge breath and shouted, "Storm be gone!" She clapped her hands together and the wind dropped, then stopped completely. "And that's how you get rid of storms," she said, laughing, and they both laughed. A laugh that began as a laugh of relief and then turned into a laugh of joy and togetherness. The voice from the lake drifted away and rejoined the circling, spiralling mist. Bea fell silent. Her eyes looked down and her shoulders slumped. "I'm tired," she said. "I need to sleep." GYRE Each caught her before she fell and took her to her bed. We let Bea sleep and didn't try and track her dreams. She was doing well, beyond expectations. She'd reached the stage of hearing the voices. When they arrived at the World Ocean Floor Conference, GYRE broke from the scheduled route. Instead of walking to the entrance, he walked up to the outer glass wall of the building. The glass mirrored the blue sky and clouds all the way up to the 40th floor. He placed his hand on the glass and gave Bea a look that she knew was testing her. His pupils divided and divided again. Bea suddenly realized why they divided. Like looking into a child's kaleidoscope, twisting the cardboard tube till the reflections create new patterns. GYRE Each blinked and gave Bea a nod, then rejoined the scheduled route and walked to the entrance of the building. He was scheduled to make a keynote speech to the conference, then join a panel discussion with leading scientific experts on ocean depletion. They were in the green zone of the conference facility, so the size of the security entourage was more for show than a sign of the potential danger they were in. Bea tried to explain that the green zone meant the most secure level of security, and the green room was just a room where they waited until it was time to go on stage. GYRE was convinced that a green zone and a green room must have some deeper spiritual significance. He searched every inch of the green room. He picked up anything he could, looked under and moved everything that would move, but found nothing. He began pacing, up and down with his gaze burning holes in the carpet. Bea didn't know how to calm him. She tried massaging him, but he shrugged her off. He was anxious about presenting to the conference, but more importantly, he was also missing his connection to the GYRE. He was cast adrift, marooned in this concrete, isolating island of land. He needed the sea, and he needed us. He needed our bodies next to his. He stopped his pacing and suddenly shouted, "I need to swim!" "You can't," Bea said. "We haven't got time. You're on in 10 minutes. He stamped his foot on the floor. "God damn it!" He began growling and pounding his fist into his hand. His pacing accelerated. He was out of his depth and Bea feared he'd burst open at the seams. She felt her stomach tighten and her mouth go dry. She swallowed and gulped noisily. "Can you stop doing that?" he shouted. "Doing what?" "That gulping thing you're doing, it's really annoying. It sounds like you're drowning." He stopped pacing and stared at her. He realized he'd snared her, caught her in his net, and she was flapping like a landed fish, gasping for air. "You're not drowning. Why are you gulping?" His searching gaze bore down into her. She scrambled to swim away from his scrutinizing spotlight. She squirmed down into the dark, bottomless sea, hoping to find a rock to hide under. She panicked. If he went after her in this mood, she'd end up crying, and he knew it. She was saved by the beep that meant they were ready for them. GYRE and Bea looked at the door, anticipating someone's knock. "I need the toilet," GYRE said, and dashed to the bathroom. The panel of esteemed experts were already assembled on stage. The chair of the panel was building up to how honoured they and the world were to have GYRE Each as their guest speaker. The noise of the crowd swelled with excitement whenever GYRE's name was mentioned. In the darkness of the backstage wings, Bea squeezed GYRE's hand and moved in close to whisper, "I'll be right here." They announced his name again. GYRE's hand slid out of Bea's grasp. She gave his arm a squeeze as he walked out into the lights. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Bea peeked round the side and saw the whole of the auditorium had got to their feet. She recoiled to her hidden position and said, "Oh my God," to herself, quietly. She heard screams and shouting. People were wailing in what can only be described as a mixture of shock and hysteria. It took 20 minutes to get everyone calm and back in their seats. Gyre thanked them all and said, "Oh boy, you sure know how to make a fella feel welcome." They all laughed. He'd put them at their ease. But Bea could hear his voice was a shallow brook, rapidly drying up under the burning glare of the world staring down at him. A breeze blew in from behind her. She saw it sweep on stage and ruffle Gyre's hair. His voice thickened and became a chorus, moving far beyond the walls and doors and out beyond the conference hall and hotel grounds. It filled the entire city, then carried on across the regions, into the countryside, till finally it flew across the ocean. And when his voice came back, it was filled with all the voices of the Gyre, and we all sang the same song together. GYRE Each laid out a trail of breadcrumbs that had the audience eating at the palm of his hand. The panel discussion went less well. Part 2. Episode 5. They were locked in their hotel room with the world clamouring at their door. Gyre was laughing hysterically, uncontrollably, laughing so much he was crying, holding his ribs and saying, "It hurts! Bloody glad it hurts, you absolute fucking idiot!" Bea was shouting at him, and this was making him laugh all the more. She heard herself saying the stupidest things. "What were you thinking? Have you any idea how this is going to look? You're a selfish, spoilt prick. You can't take anything seriously. This was your big chance and you blew it. Have you any idea how much trouble you've caused?" The angrier she got, the more he laughed. "You called the chief scientific advisor of the World Oceanic Research Unit a caveman." Gyre's laughter stopped abruptly. "I did not." "You had a picture of a caveman up there on the screen and you said there was no difference between him and that." "I actually said there was a huge difference, not physically, obviously, but in the architecture of his brain." "You said he was stupid." "I said the difference between the caveman and him was the same as the difference between him and me." "That's what I'm talking about. You came across as an arrogant prick, and when he got mad at you..." "He did get mad, didn't he?" "Rightly so." "He actually went red in the face. I mean, actually red. I've never seen anyone go that red before." "This is not a good thing, Gyre. You need to apologise." "Apologise for what?" "For challenging him to your stupid contest. You made him look like an idiot in front of the whole world." "He challenged me, actually." "Yes, to prove what you were saying." "And I humbly declined saying something stupid about him being a tree." "I said it would be like challenging a tree to a race." "You see, that's what I mean. Arrogant and fucking stupid." They went round and round like this till they were both exhausted, and then they sat in a fuming, tight silence. We have 50 words for silence, and this was a silence of belligerence, plus righteousness, plus solitude, plus remorse. Similar to the phrase cutting off your nose to spite your face while shooting yourself in the foot. We noticed that their breathing fell into time with each other. Bea felt an intense urge to ask Sam something, anything. She didn't even want a cigarette, she just had to get out, get away from him, GYRE Each. The corridor had been cleared, the whole floor was empty and silent. It wasn't till she got outside that she realised she didn't have her cigarettes with her. She turned to walk back but spotted someone just in view, leaning on a pillar, smoking. Before she'd finished explaining how she'd left her cigarettes inside, the woman had passed her a packet of tobacco and said, I can roll it for you if you like. Bea held the packet of tobacco like it was a bar of gold. No, it's fine, she said. I can roll my own. The woman peered over her sunglasses with a raised eyebrow that said, Really? Bea easily slotted into reminiscing about roll-ups, how you had to get the right amount of baccy, tap it down so it's not too tight or too loose, fold at the corners and then roll it up nice and easy. The woman passed her a lighter and Bea noticed her sinewy hands. She could see the blue veins through the paper-thin skin. She caught a glimpse of the woman's face. Carved deep lines scored down her cheeks from her eyes. Lines from her lips, like they were drawn on with black marker pen. She caught Bea staring at her and shot her a dagger-like glare. Bea darted her eyes away and took her first drag of the roll-up. She didn't want to embarrass herself by going into a full-blown coughing fit. The tobacco made her head spin and left her feeling woozy. She blew out a thick, dense cloud of grey and brown smoke, a dragon from the old days. The second drag was deeper. She felt the nicotine hammer down her bloodstream. She closed her eyes for a second and was absorbed in an eternal bliss. This place, this time, this planet Earth, deep into the land, sea and sky, and all the way up into the heavens above. The woman cracked a smile. Looks like you needed that. Bea laughed. It's been a while and it's been a hell of a day. It's nice to have a proper roll-up. Where'd you get this baccy? The woman's face dropped like a stone dropped in water. She scrutinised Bea from behind her sunglasses, then turned away and smoked her cigarette without answering. Bea looked round and felt awkward. Maybe she'd been too familiar, too chatty. She'd forgotten what it's like. She'd been away too long. You don't just strike up a conversation with people in the city. She'd overstepped the mark somehow. Her gaze landed on the two plainclothes security officers standing just far enough away, and she immediately panicked. After the fiasco of the panel discussion, she had to be careful. She had to protect GYRE Each. She'd been stupid to leave him and come outside, but then she realised they weren't watching her. They were watching the smoking woman. A slot machine of pennies all dropped in place at once. The woman was about the right age. White hair that would have once been black. Bea scrutinised her wrinkled face. The woman turned, lowered her sunglasses, and fixed Bea with her gaze. You know, when you stare at someone like that, some people might take that as a provocation. And in that moment, when their eyes met, Bea saw Jay looking right back at her. Are you Jules? She said. The woman flinched and glanced quickly over to the two security officers. She then moved a step closer to Bea and spoke quickly and quietly. Who are you and what do you want? Bea laughed nervously. She felt tears burning up inside her, ready to be released. Her stomach began to somersault. I'm Bea, she started shaking. It could have been the nicotine racing through her body, or it could have been the shock and excitement. I knew Jay. I was with Jay. You know, we were together. He talked a lot about you. She realised she was talking too fast and tried to slow down. The woman tilted her head and took another look at Bea. He did? Yeah, you are Jules, right? Jay's mother. Jules took another drag of her cigarette, then another, and then a rapid third. She dropped the dog end on the ground and crushed it with a twist of her boot. She nodded towards the hotel and said, So what are you doing here? Bea tried to calm herself. Probably the same as you. They both stood there for a moment, not knowing what to do next. Bea realised she had to take control of the situation. Jules looked flighty. She looked like she might bolt. Bea had the sudden urge to grab her and not let her go. The security officers had picked up on the fact that something was wrong and were trying to look like they hadn't. Jules moved in to stand side by side with Bea, so they had their backs to the two security officers. She whispered, No one calls me Jules. Jules was a stupid little girl that got out of her depth. Bea could feel her smoky breath on her face. It's Julie, just Julie. I've been doing okay, thank you very much, a fresh start, a new life. Then I get this call to come all the way out here. I get picked up in this huge car and arrive in this fancy hotel. No one's telling me anything. All they said was it was about Jay. That's why I agreed to come. I'm supposed to be meeting someone important. No one's saying anything, it's all secrets and I hate that. She lifted her head and looked directly at Bea. Do you know what's going on? Do you know where Jay is? Jay's dead. Did no one tell you? Bea couldn't see what was going on behind the dark glasses, but Jules remained motionless for a long time. Her voice then crackled out. Can you take me to where he's buried? Bea looked over Julie's shoulder and saw the two security officers marching towards them. She realised she didn't have much time. It's okay, fellas, she said in her Director of Operations voice. She flashed them her ID badge. I'm guessing you're here to escort our guest to meet GYRE Each. The two security stopped dead in their tracks and looked at each other. I know we had dates and times arranged, agreed protocol and all that, but seeing as we're all here, why don't we just get the ball rolling and take Julie, up to the suite right now. I'll call my people and let them know we're on our way. Bea took Julie's arm and guided her towards the hotel before the security officers could say anything. Julie's arm slid into hers, folding and fitting in so naturally, in the comfortable way that ex-cons can do so easily. Once inside the hotel suite, the security team, the entourage, Bea and Julie waited in the main room. Bea cleared her throat and called out, "GYRE, are you decent?" His voice drifted in from the side room. "How do you mean?" "I mean, have you got some clothes on? There's someone here you need to meet." Before she took Julie in to meet GYRE, Bea cleared the main room and waited till the last of the security team had gone. She then called out, "GYRE, can you hear me? You can come in now." They waited, and Bea held Julie to stop her collapsing. Seeing GYRE Each walk through the door was like seeing Jay himself roll back the stone and walk out of the tomb. Julie burst into tears. She ran forwards and held GYRE to make sure he was real. When she could speak, she stroked his face and said, "Why is your skin green?" Then the floodgates opened and their babbling began. Bea slipped away. She closed the door quietly and left them to it. We said to Sam, "Sam, does the world know anything about the GYRE? It's generally known that there are children living here, but no one's really interested in what that might mean. Would they be interested if they knew what we are? Do you know what you are? We're beginning to. Sam, how would they react to meeting us? Initially they'll be enthralled, but that will quickly turn to suspicion, paranoia, resentment, fear, anger, and outright hatred. What will happen then? It will be ugly. What will we do? You'll hopefully be long gone by then. Sam, how easy would it be to organise a World Ocean Floor Conference? It would not be difficult, but it would take some time. What would you want it to achieve? If you could get all the world leaders together, then at some point you could suggest they invite us along. We could be keynote speakers, something like that." Sam said, "Assuming all that was possible, what would you want it to achieve?" "Just that." "And why would the world leaders want to invite you to a conference when they haven't even heard about you?" "You could say, we own the entire Pacific seabed, so it's in their interest to have us there." "I'm not sure we would want that to be known in the wider world just yet." "You could say, we speak for the future generations." "I'm not sure they'd be that interested." "You could say, we have a solution that will save the planet." "Do you?" Yes, it's very simple. Okay, leave it with me, but it will take time. How much time? How many of you are thinking of going to this conference? All of us. I'm not sure that's wise. How many would you suggest go? A representative small group. We don't know how to decide who that should be. You could choose randomly, pick names out of a hat. We do not have such a hat. Okay, I could just pick for you. No need, I'll go. We didn't know what to say or do at this point, and neither, it seems, did Sam. We were now dividing and multiplying at an exponential rate. Gyre Each had decided he would go by himself. By himself, he decided he would go. Gyre Each by himself would go to the conference. Part 2, Episode 6. Imagine a concert in a great hall. The orchestra are tuning up and the audience are all talking amongst themselves. It's hard to pick out what any one person is saying. But then the concert starts, the instruments play as one. The choirs sing, the audience join in, and that's what we do. As the Gyre, we are the symphony. The voices we began to hear in the ocean were a cacophony. In the sea at night, our collective mind can swim through the sea of the collective unconscious. And in our sleep lab, we can dive deeper and mine these memories. Our first trawl threw up a confusing amount of random images. A bird, a jet-black raven, flitting and fluttering, trapped in a staccato rhythm of focusing on this, then this, then this, head tilting, beak pecking, beady eye piercing the thin veil of our dreamlike sleep. Then this, then this, then this. The bird stopped flapping as our dreaming became sharper, more focused. The raven messenger settled down to listen, and there we saw her, the bold lady. We watched her. She was smiling. When she smiled, her mouth would curl up at the side. Her eyes would soften, and she would look at her baby in a way that said, "I still can't quite believe I made you." She sat him on her lap till she groaned and slid him off, saying, "You're too heavy." In these memories there is no linear time. We jump forwards months, years. They played dressing up with whatever she had in the van, pieces of material, scarves, hats and jewellery. She wore a battered top hat in those days and plenty of crushed velvet and cheesecloth. Fingerless gloves fed her a continuous stream of roll-ups. We could smell the strange mixed aroma of tobacco and patchouli oil. They danced and we danced with them. She would fling the baby Jay into piles of pillows and he would shriek with laughter. She was so attentive to her baby boy. She had no idea we were watching her. The van was full of dangling bells, swirling mobiles, chimes and tinkling mirrors. Crystals on threads to catch the sun and fill the whole interior with dancing dots of light. We could feel the soft wool of her green jumper, elbows patched up with purple cord, cuffs on the sleeves all frayed where she chewed them. We could hear the jangle of the bangles and bracelets on her wrists and ankles as she swayed and moved up and down the van. And we sway and move with her. This is how we connect. This is how we drill down deeper. The raven's wing swept us away, taps its beak, tries to make us scatter, but we are the Gyre. We scatter and regroup with ease. The messenger raven, the crow, shifted, ruffled its feathers, settled its wings. The bird tilted its head. "Ready?" it said. Yes, we replied, even though we weren't sure what message this raven would bring next. Another summer of sunshine, a late summer breeze blows dandelion clocks into the sunset. Memories float in of Julie, the girl, 17 and into Mark Bolan and David Bowie. Joss sticks, juniper, boys, beads and bangles. Our grandmother, Julie. Julie and her friends hitched to London, pitched up at the Windsor Free Festival to soak up anything that might be left of the summer of love. She wasn't looking for a boyfriend. Seeing Terry changed all of that. She was gawping, mouth open, eyes wide, not blinking. Her friends laughed and nudged her. "Come on then," they said, pulling her by her arm. "Let's go and meet the Incredible Hulk." Jay was born a year later at 11 pounds and 7 ounces. He was the biggest baby anyone had ever seen. Julie was absolutely certain she was never going through that again. After Windsor, she went home to her mum and dad's and couldn't stop thinking about the festival, those endless days of sunshine, listening to bands outdoors in a field, and of course, Terry. At home, the four walls closed in. She couldn't bear having to sit and watch the TV with her mum and dad. She had to get out. "Where are you going?" Phone box. "Who are you phoning at this time of night?" "None of your business." "Let's have your back chat, young lady, and don't slam the door." The door was slammed. Terry bought an old ambulance and set about converting it. He drove it over to Julie's and her mum and dad came out to give it the once-over. Her mother said, "What will people think, you driving around in an old ambulance?" Julie just smiled at her. "They can think what they like." They didn't go back to Julie's mum and dad's. By the time Windsor came around the following year, Julie was heavily pregnant with Jay and feeling the strain. She was hoping Jay would be born at Windsor. It seemed a fitting place, but he waited till Stonehenge to make his entrance into the world. Julie began to sing, just to a small crowd sitting round a campfire, till she built her confidence up. Julie picked up a guitar and started playing Moonshadow. Someone put her name down on one of the smaller stages that had an open mic spot at the Sidmouth Folk Festival. She was pushed and shoved and almost carried up on stage, until there she was, standing in front of the mic, staring out at the crowd of people all drinking beer in the sunshine, and she froze. Her mind went completely blank. She couldn't think what to sing. She felt like she had a pine cone stuck in her throat. Her friends started whooping and clapping, chanting, "Julie, Julie, Julie," and that was it. She felt the angels lift her up on tiny threads. She felt as if someone was standing behind her, holding her. She could lean back, and we were there, supporting her all the way. From out of nowhere, Joni Mitchell appeared and stood next to her. Joni Mitchell smiled and started singing, "I've seen the world from both sides now," and Julie joined in. When the song finished, Joni held Julie's hand and raised her arm up as they bowed together. The crowd were on their feet. Julie looked round and realised with horror that she was alone on the stage. There had been no Joni Mitchell. We, the GYRE, had been singing with her. We'd been holding her. We'd been right by her side. The crowd were all staring at her in silence. The moment seemed to be endless, but then the crowd erupted into an applause that sent a shockwave towards her that nearly knocked her off her feet. We swayed with the force of it. We know this force. It travels across all time and space in the world. People came up to her with tears in their eyes. All night, people who'd been at the other stages wanted to know what the hell had happened to make the crowd go so wild. The word went round it was this new singer called Jules. Her friends looked at her differently that night. They saw her in a different light. The messenger raven flapped its wings and stabbed its beak in our direction. Had enough? But we wanted more. Jules driving her van to the benefit gig. We felt her heart sink as she opened the door and saw how few people were there. We rolled in the dark ocean and let our heads tip into the memory. The gig was to support the Women for Life on Earth march. They'd walked all the way from Cardiff to Bristol, and only 10 people had turned up. Jules was feeling a mixture of injustice, anger and desolation. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened," she said, as she packed up after the gig. The women didn't mind. They'd already set their sights on the long road ahead. We felt Jules's confusion. These women were so straight, just like her mum. But by the end of the evening, they felt like family. We felt Julie's heart open in a way that it had never had the chance to before. The next day, Jules and Jay walked with the women to the edge of the city, meaning to just say goodbye, but then they carried on walking with them and didn't turn back. The raven appears again, laughing in a way that only ravens can, its shiny black eye winking at us. We tumble into teenage Jay, the mud and the rain and the soldiers behind fences. Plenty of campfires and singing, those long hot summers and the long dreary damp and dark winters. They weren't even supposed to be going to Stonehenge that year, but somehow they ended up driving down the wrong country lane, the wrong land at the wrong time, and they found themselves caught. Riot police blocking the lane both ways, so they tried to escape by driving into a field. The police in their vans with their shields and batons went after them. The news footage shocked all those families up and down the country, happily sat at home on their sofas, watching it on TV. The raven flicks its head and finds a better perch. Jay hears the police smashing their way onto the van, the clattering and breaking of timber and glass, the beating and the screaming as they dragged his mammy out through the broken window. The smell of their excitement and fear that they sprayed over everything. That stench stuck in his nostrils and made him retch. We feel his fear and anger. We feel the heat from the flames that ignited inside his mother. A rage that quickly turned into the roaring fire that engulfed Jay's whole world. Jay and Jules were separated in the chaos. He hid in the woods for 3 weeks. When he finally ventured out, he lost all his hair. Jules was put on trial for breach of the peace and assaulting a police officer. In those days, they had no screens up around the dock, and the trial of a young girl in a magistrate's court hardly warranted heightened security. Before the case could be concluded, she'd vaulted the dock, picked up a biro, and stabbed the magistrate in the neck. Jules managed to get word to a friend who got word to another friend who found Jay and made a home for him on a Route Master double-decker painted night blue and covered in stars. He travelled with the peace convoy for another few years, till that was finally broken up, and anyone that was left moved to Spain. Jay knew he couldn't contact his mother. He had to stay safe, stay hidden. If he went to see her, tried to find her, he'd be taken into care. "That's not happening to you," his mother had said. He moved through the edgelands between town and country. He floated through the landscape like a ghost. Some sights were better than others. Some people were better than others. He drifted on that late summer breeze till a gale-force storm blew him all the way to a protest camp that was trying to save the trees that would be cut down to make way for the roundabout that would mean the river and all its tributaries would be diverted. So when the summer rains came, the village further down the valley would be flooded. Part 2, Episode 7. Bea was asleep on the sofa in their hotel suite. She was drawn out of her sleep by a voice singing so far away, a voice so soft yet so compelling, a voice swirling out of the morning mist. It was calling her name. It was encouraging her to join in with the song. She let her voice join the lullaby. She felt herself sway gently like a boat rocking on the calmest of seas. The woman appeared on the golden boat beckoning her. The voice and the singing and the song were shining bright like stars. Bea felt a hand gently shaking her. She blinked her eyes open and saw Julie's face. She saw the green flash of the jade earring in her ear and heard the jangle of silver bracelets round her thin wrists. The strands of Julie's white hair brushed against Bea's face. Bea had fallen asleep, still dressed in all her clothes. She was having trouble opening her eyes. "Sorry to wake you," Julie said, her smile widening and warming Bea like the morning sun. Julie stroked Bea's brow. Her fingers felt so soothing. Bea finally focused her eyes on her. "Have I been asleep long?" Julie laughed. "You were flat out, so we just left you. You've been asleep a solid 18 hours. Julie was dressed all in black. Black jeans, black t-shirt, black jacket and black boots. Her white hair was tied up in a haphazard knot. She said, "He wanted you to wake up and come and welcome the dawn." Bea sat up and shook herself. Her throat was sore. She was desperate for a drink of water. She got up slowly and plodded towards the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. When she walked into the lounge, she felt like she'd been caught in a trap. She felt like she'd done something wrong and they'd found out. It could have been her eyes adjusting to the pale dawn light, but when she looked at GYRE Each, it looked like he had spheres of light circling around him. He was stood by the window. Julie was perched on the windowsill smoking a cigarette. Julie began the conversation, still staring at the slow sunrise. "It seems I'm coming to join you all on your battleship." Bea looked at GYRE, who'd sat himself down in a huge armchair. She guessed he'd invited Julie to join them within seconds of meeting her. Julie said, "I've heard all about Triton from the boy wonder here, but what do you make of it, Bea?" Bea began describing Triton, but Julie cut her off. "I don't need all that sales crap. I mean, what's it really like? Can you really disappear and never come back?" "No one will find you, yes, if that's what you mean." Julie turned her head to look directly at Bea. "I mean, don't you just go completely nuts, stuck out there in the middle of the ocean, all trapped together? How come you've not killed each other yet?" Bea laughed and thought the obvious answer was no. They hadn't exactly killed each other, but what kind of life was it? She rarely saw anyone or socialized, and most of her interactions were with Sam. So what kind of life is that? GYRE chipped in as if he was continuing the logical extension of what Bea was thinking. "Not so much different to prison then," he said, raising one eyebrow and looking at Julie. Julie shook her head and scoffed. "He's got away with him, hasn't he?" she said to Bea, then threw her gaze back at GYRE. "You know, if you and your pals in the GYRE can actually read people's thoughts, you should have also developed the etiquette and social intelligence to know how fucking rude it is." She stubbed out her cigarette and jumped off her perch, then walked slowly over to GYRE. She moved like a crow. GYRE shrank back in his chair with each step she took towards him. He flinched as she moved her hand to his face and took hold of his jaw. "Now it's my turn," she said, and rolled his face to one side, then the other. "Oh, I see it now," she said. "Let's see what's on your mind, GYRE Each." She looked into his eyes like she was looking down a burrow into the earth to see what creature might be taking refuge down there. She said, "You, all of you, GYRE, back there on your battleship Triton, can you hear me? Can you see me? 'Cause I'm looking right at you." She tilted his head as if she was trying to look under his eyelids. She whispered in GYRE's ear in her gravelly smoker's voice, I see you, Gyre. I'm with you, all of you. I'll hold you as dearly as you wish to be held. I'm calling you as you've called me, but be ready. Be ready for what we will bring forth into the world when we are finally together. She closed her eyes and listened, then nodded, as if agreeing with whatever reply came back to her in the silence. When she opened her eyes, she looked into Gyre's face as if she was looking into a crystal ball. She held his head with both hands and flung her gaze up to the ceiling. I know you can hear me as I hear you. I know you feel me. She threw her gaze back down to stare into Gyre's eyes. I can see you now. Then she sang, come out, wherever you are. I hear you, I hear you, I hear you. Gyre Each was holding his breath. He didn't dare move. As soon as she let him go, he shuddered and he shook and he gasped for air like he'd been drowning. Even after Julie was back on her perch at the windowsill, he could still taste the traces of tobacco she'd left on his skin. When Gyre had gone to order some food, Bea took Julie aside. I can't exactly take you to where Jay's buried, but we have a memorial shrine for him on Triton. Julie nodded without saying anything. Can I ask you something, Bea? Yes, of course. I've just spent an intense 18 hours with this GYRE Each. Bea laughed. Yeah, sorry about that. He can be a bit full on. That's okay. It was all useful. But they think I'm some kind of bowl lady. Do you know anything about that? Bowl lady? No. I've never heard of it. What is it? I don't know. I thought you might help. They'd been searching for him for 3 hours when he called Bea to ask her to pick him up. She found him standing on the corner of a suburban sidewalk, waving his arms in excitement. He shouted to her, Look, they've got lawns! By the grass stains on his shirt, Bea knew he'd been lying on someone's lawn, rolling around and rubbing his face in the grass and mud. He ran towards her, grabbed her arm and dragged her towards the house. Hurry, he said, I've got someone I want you to meet. He didn't knock on the door, he just barged his way in. Bea stopped for a moment to gather her breath. She walked into the living room of a very nice, moderately well-off family home. Mum, Dad, 2 kids, 1 boy, 1 girl. Bea immediately started running through the procedures they'd have to go through to get this family debriefed and decompressed. Gyre went over to the wall and stroked it. Look, Mom, the walls are covered in paper. It's like actual wallpaper. Bea laughed nervously and checked the faces of the adults. They still had wide smiles stretched across their faces. They weren't thinking this was odd in any way at all. Gyre put his hand on the boy's shoulder. So this is KK and his amazing sister Mel Mo. I got that right, yeah? Both kids nodded. They're the brother and sister Supremo. I just had to drop by and see them in real life. The Gyre are going to explode with jealousy. Gyre made an explosive sound and mimed a rocket taking off. Everyone laughed. He produced a piece of paper and thrust it towards them, then fished out a pen from his pocket. You've got to sign this to the Gyre. It's like an autograph. Yes, in fact, that's exactly what it is, an autograph. Bea could tell he was riding high, and she looked round to see if there was anything to hand to help her contain the situation. As the kids awkwardly wrote their names on the piece of paper, Gyre let his gaze wander to the window and the street outside. Is that a bus stop? He said, pointing to the pavement beyond the lawn. There, where all those people are standing in a line. The parents looked outside and both answered, yes. Bea watched the blood drain from Gyre's face. His pupils were dilating individually. Then the pupil in his left eye split in 2 and then split in 2 again. He blinked and they returned to normal. He dashed out of the room, out of the house and ran to the bus stop. The mum and dad looked at Bea, and they all went over to the window to see what Gyre was up to. The kids were still busy trying to write their names. It was obviously something they'd never done before, so it was taking all their concentration. A bus pulled up, and the people who'd been standing at the bus stop got on. Then Gyre went to get on. Bea opened the front door to shout to him. He was chatting to the bus driver and pointing at the house. Then he got back off the bus and ran back across the lawn. He met Bea at the door, panting and out of breath. His face was flushed with excitement. "What's going on?" she said. "Nothing, it's okay." He shooed her inside and got the kids to show everyone the model they'd been working on. GYRE Each explained how the GYRE had given out an open challenge to anyone in the world to design a pod that could smash through 200 meters of rock without falling apart. "And you guys won, right?" he said, and the two kids nodded again. "The genius of these guys is that the geosub not only smashes, but it twists its way in like an earthworm. That's right, isn't it? That's how you got the idea from watching a worm out there on your lawn. Gee, I love your lawn." The kids both nodded and ran the simulation onto the end where the geosub cracks through the layer of rock and emerges on the other side. The geosub then dropped into the ocean they hoped would be there. This, of course, was the moon around Neptune, the moon called Triton. The possibility of another ocean on another Triton was just too much for GYRE Each. Bea listened but was distracted by the commotion happening outside. Back on the bus, the passengers were huddled round the driver. One of the passengers had got off the bus and was looking up and down the street. Then Bea heard the wailing siren of an ambulance. Bea took Gyre to one side while the family watched the unfolding drama. "What did you say to the bus driver?" Gyre copied her secretive tone. "I was just asking him if he'd wait for a second while I got my sick grandmother." "What did the bus driver say?" "He said he'd only wait a minute, but I knew he'd wait longer." To Gyre's surprise, Bea grabbed his arm. "Gyre, what's happening out there?" she hissed through her teeth. Gyre said, "I guess they're taking the driver away and consoling the passengers. It'll dawn on them later that they had a lucky escape. If the driver had his pulmonary edema whilst driving, he'd have careered across that busy junction 3 blocks down and possibly killed a lot of people. It was better to get him to stop there and wait. That way, no one died. Except for the driver, of course. But the paramedics might be able to, bump, bump, bump." He mimed pumping someone's chest. Before they left, he made sure he picked up his pen. GYRE Each was dressed in black robes, a wide-sleeved tunic tied at the waist with a purple cord. His hair was tied up on the top of his head, held together with 2 chopsticks. His face was painted dark blue, with thousands of stars scattered over his cheeks, forehead and chin. Orange circles were painted round his eyes. In his red hands he carried a white bowl. He walked slowly towards where Bea and Julie were seated. Incense was burning and the hotel room was filled with smoke. Julie looked over at Bea and raised her eyebrow. Bea shrugged as if to say, "I don't know either." A bell chimed and Gyre knelt in front of Julie and placed the bowl down on the floor in front of her. Then he shuffled back and sat, looking at the bowl. Nothing happened for a few seconds, then slowly the bowl began to fill with water. Bea frowned and looked at Julie. Julie raised both her eyebrows. The bowl was filling up with water by itself. They watched it till it got to half full, then it stopped. The water then began to swirl in the bowl, and out of the swirling gyre came a fine mist. The wisps of mist spiraled up out of the bowl like a miniature tornado. And when the tornado opened up, they saw images appearing, flickering at first and then solidifying. The images were black and white, scenes of a mother playing with her baby. It was Julie in her van. More scenes of Julie and Jay walking with the women to Greenham. Then the image of Julie and Jay came into full colour. Julie watched and couldn't speak. She held her breath. They could not only see the images, they could hear them and feel them. This was much more than black and white movies. Scenes appeared in front of them of Bea and Gyre in the treetops, the two of them on the farm together. Bea and Gyre then turned into full colour. Then the images faded into the swirling mist. The mist dispersed and the water drained out of the bowl. Julie and Bea sat looking at the empty bowl. GYRE Each moved forward, picked up the bowl, then offered it with his outstretched hands. "It's a gift for you," he said, "from the Gyre." Neither Julie nor Bea knew what to say. Part 2, Episode 8. No one was more surprised than Bea with how easily and wholeheartedly she became a mother. Not just to GYRE Each, but to all of us in the Gyre. She clearly remembers the moment her transformation occurred. She was surrounded by a horde of 1 to 3-year-olds, and the noise of our din didn't grate on her anymore, or make her feel like her head would explode. Instead, she laughed and carried on laughing. We crawled over her, held her hand, wiped our snot on her, threw up on her, brought her toys and books to read to us, curled up and slept on her. She sang and cooed to us. She saw the world through our wide eyes and didn't think about anything else. When more Gyre babies came along, she was there as a birthing partner and cried as each new pair of eyes met hers. Kid Gyre was the last child of our generation. By then, most of us had left the nursery and were now absorbed in learning all about Triton. GYRE Each, being the eldest, was already poring over blueprints of how the city was constructed. The rest of us were soaking up all aspects of life on our floating island. It wasn't long before we became the oceanographers, chemical engineers, civil engineers, marine biologists, astrophysicists, evolutionary biologists and food technologists who ran the Triton research facility and led all future research and development projects. As we took control of Triton, Bea felt us pull away, gather in our own groups and talk in quiet voices. We became secretive and dismissive. We were starting to become the Gyre. She poured every last drop of the mother love she had left into Kid Gyre. She wanted to hold on to him for as long as she could. She wanted to keep him as a child forever. She knew we shunned him because of it. We pushed him away, rejected him like a cub who spent too much time with humans. He was always trailing behind us. We never waited for him to catch up. We never waited. We never waited. We gather in the lower deck, then enter the airlock and take our seats on the benches. We press our backs against the wall, initiate the door release mechanism and wait. We adopted elaborate rituals to appease the ocean kami, the spirit jinn of the sea. Slow and slowed and deep beneath, half human, half awake, half asleep. We wait and hold fast. The tanks fill quickly. Water rises fast and we are flooded. We have you now, the ocean cries. Ice like spikes stab our stomachs and spines. We squash the panic rising in our trembling chests and begin our babble of the sea, to ward off the drowned and lingering lost souls, to remember Kid Gyre and protect us against his fate. We use our breath to bless our whisper. And of this time I tell of tales told over the sea, and on which ocean this planet bobs, this bobbing babble we sea folk speak. Tired of land we lost to be, and be beyond and old, still commend the south and east, mending wise the west beneath. The water rises above our chests to neck and chin, then mouthpiece in. We rinse our masks, then swill them out. We close our eyes and quickly finish our prayers. Beneath the hidden depths we bow and blunder. We often sought beyond and yonder. Thou cast upon the falling plunder. Who whipped up this blackening storm? We pray we'll rise again before the dawn is torn asunder. We're all at once and all at sea. We dread not carefully. Thou tremble past our cast-out nests. We pray you catch the swell and see. And we will sing the siren's call to bring you to us one and all. And with that, the hatch door opens and we are free. We all give the okay and swim out one by one. Last one out taps the keypad to drain the chamber and close the hatch door. We swim, not straight to the surface. We take our time, slowly flick our flippered feet, barrel turn, crisscross and weave in and out. Then we all turn as one shoal and slowly head up to break the surface. But who'll crack the eggshell first? It's our game of dare, even after the tragic loss of losing one of our own. Kid Gyre, we still play the game of who can stay under the longest. When the summer rains came, the river that had always been a babbling brook became a raging torrent that swept away the field crops and flooded the village further down the valley. They drove the Land Rover with the dinghy on a trailer away from the farm as far as they could till the road disappeared into the newly formed lake. Below them, in the distance, they could see rooftops and treetops sticking out of the rippling black water. They had backpacks and medical supplies, thermal blankets and energy bars. Thick cloud blocked out the moon and stars. The only light in the sky was the sweeping searchlight of the helicopter. There were no words. They all knew what they had to do, and speaking would only have trivialized the event. They pushed the inflatable dinghy into the flood water and jumped on board. When they hit a shallow patch, a slight raise or a hill, Jay jumped out, took up the rope and dragged them along till the water got deep again and the dinghy could be paddled. They went over one final hill and began to drop into the deeper flooding. They were soon in the lake that stretched as far as the eye could see. Their oars weren't even close to touching the bottom. The rain eased off a little as they paddled slowly towards the rooftops sticking out of the water. Then they stopped paddling and waited. The flood water gently rocked the dinghy. The wind was cold against their eyes. They called out and listened but heard nothing, so they paddled ahead slowly, straining to hear. Then Jay heard it, a cry from somewhere. He heard it again. Where? They said. They'd heard nothing. Over there! Jay pointed to one of the houses with flood water all the way up to the second floor windows. The helicopter was now getting too close to hear anything. Before they knew what was happening, Jay was over the side and away. They tried to shout above the noise of the helicopter, but the helicopter thought they were waving for it to come closer. The downdraft created widening circles of waves in the water. Two of the boat crew paddled faster, trying to follow the general direction they'd seen Jay set off in. Jay felt a sudden warm current of water sweep him along effortlessly. We felt it too. We thought at first it was coming from him. His vast bulk was generating its own warm current in the cold flood water. He swam so easily he reached the house in no time. He peered through the upstairs window and saw movement. He could hear people on the inside shouting. He waved back at them and shouted, "I'm coming in!" He dived down and tried to open the window but couldn't shift it. He came up for air and looked at the window again. He saw a woman and her two kids in the water, clinging on to the edge of a wardrobe. He dived down again and he smashed the window, then he swam through the shattered glass and came up inside the room. He didn't realise the broken glass had slashed his arm and cut a slice out of his back. His bald head surfaced right next to the woman. She looked terrified and ecstatic at the same time. He smiled at her and her two shivering kids. "Don't worry," he said, breathing heavily. "I'll get you out. There's a dinghy and a helicopter on its way." The woman laughed and then started crying. The two kids, a boy and a girl, looked at each other, not really knowing what was going on. "Can you swim down?" he said. "We can get out through the window." The woman looked at her two kids' terrified faces. "I don't think so. I'm sorry. We didn't know what to do. The water came so quickly. We ran upstairs thinking we'd be safe, but it just kept coming." "It's okay," Jay said, and his smile made her feel safe. He swam over to the window and kicked at it and kicked it again until the whole frame and some of the brickwork crashed into the water, leaving a gaping hole in the bedroom wall. He gave the kids a smile and a wink. "I'll get you up on the roof and then we'll get the boat over to you." He held out his arm to the girl clinging to the edge of the wardrobe. "Okay, you first." She shook her head vigorously. He held his hand out to the boy. The boy shook his head as well. "No?" Jay said. "Okay. How about you, Mum?" She was willing, but the kids both screamed at her to not leave them. Jay laughed. "Okay, how about all of you then?" He turned and gestured for the woman to get on his back. She hesitated, but then let go of the wardrobe and wrapped her arms tightly round Jay's neck. He picked up the girl with one hand, then paddled round for the boy. They all clung on to Jay wherever they could. He began making his way to the hole in the wall where the window had been. He didn't feel the blood draining from him, or the warm current slowly seeping away. He got them all to hang onto the side of the house while he found a foothold to get on the roof. Once up, he lay himself flat and stretched down to pick the boy up first, then the girl, then Mum. They were all sat up on the roof before they really knew what was happening. Jay sat with them for a moment, catching his breath. He was thinking how beautiful it looked, the rippling black water stretching out as far as he could see, treetops breaking the surface here and there. He took off his backpack and passed it to the woman. "I'll go and get the boat. There's a thermal blanket in there and some energy bars." She suddenly realised what he meant. "No, don't leave us," she pleaded. Jay held her hand. "Don't worry, I'll get the dinghy and get you out of here. I'll be back in no time." He lowered himself off the roof and dropped back into the water. As he swam away from the house and into the huge blackness before him, he realised he couldn't see the dinghy. He looked up and couldn't see or hear the helicopter. He swam on and began to feel the cut on his arm open up. He felt the slice down his back weep out warm blood. It was numb and stinging at the same time. As he swam, he lost all sense of near and far and up and down. He heard voices. We called out to him, but weren't sure he could hear us. The voices he could hear weren't ours. The words were full of things he knew but couldn't remember. We began to chant over and over, telling him how we swim in the oceans well, how we remember all those who've gone before us. We began to sing, and he heard our song. He heard his mother, Julie, singing on stage, singing just for him, singing to him as a baby. His thoughts began to drift apart like seaweed disentangling itself in the wave. He couldn't surrender. He turned, started swimming back towards the house, but the warm current that had carried him along so easily suddenly switched direction and swept him away. The water cami had become impatient and had lashed out. The cold set like concrete around his arms and legs. He'd lost too much blood. He was sinking fast. Our hearts cried out. Not like this. We were so close, but now the cold closed in until he could no longer swim. He was gripped by a cold so comforting it was easier to give in. He sank down and kept on sinking. We couldn't reach him. We had to let him go. He sank like Kid Gyre. When the woman and her 2 kids were eventually rescued from the roof of their house, she wanted to find the man who'd appeared out of nowhere. The man who'd risen up out of the water like a great landmass, like an island of calm. She wanted to find the great hulk of a man who carried her and her 2 kids to safety. The man who'd given her his thermal blanket, who'd given her kids energy bars, who'd given them all hope. She wanted to find him and thank him personally, but by then it was too late. He'd already drowned. 2 weeks later, the work to build Triton was finished, and the core moved out to the Pacific and never went back. End of part 2.